Welcome to what I would suggest to you is a very significant event in this pre-election run-up. First, I would suggest across the country and in our own riding. We have 3 of the 4 political parties in our riding both cooperating and co-sponsoring this event. I think that is a first. The Conservatives were invited to participate, but they did decline. So just so that you know, they had opportunity to participate. And of course, our topic this evening is on electoral reform, which I would suggest, I think we would all agree, is the foundation of our democracy. My name is Sue Young. I am with Renewing Democracy Through Cooperation, and we're a small but rapidly growing group of concerned citizens in this riding who have been meeting since the summer. And as you can imagine, we have many concerns, but we've managed somehow to distill them into 3 major concerns. First of all, the policy decisions being taken by our current government without majority voter support. And Gisela will be addressing that. So folks, this government does not have the support of the majority of the electorate. And I'll let Gisela expound on that. Secondly, we're concerned about the erosion of our democracy. So, prime example, decreasing voter turnout, especially among our youth. Look around. The age I would suggest is, on average, not young. Now, of course, most of us would exclude ourselves from that demographic, but there we go. And the consequences, for example, of our new Elections Act, how's that going to affect our democracy? The concentration and the growing concentration of power in the office of the Prime Minister. So erosion of our democracy, we have to look after it, folks. And then thirdly, our concern is the extremely partisan and vitriolic tenor of the political discourse among our politicians. So from those concerns comes our name. We are about renewing our democracy through cooperation among parties, politicians, and their supporters. Just a tiny task. We should have it done shortly. The objective of Gisela's presentation is to increase awareness of how our outdated voting system, first past the post, is negatively impacting Canada. She wants to build support for Fair Vote Canada's campaign to make 2015 the last unfair election, at least federally, and motivate citizens to demand that proportional representation be implemented during the next term of Parliament. So please, folk, help me welcome Gisela Ruckert, all the way from Kamloops, BC, our own Okanagan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Sue. And thanks to all of you for coming. I'm going to step down here because my notes are on this table. Is that all right with everyone? Can you still see me? Sure. Thank you. Let's have a vote on it. Okay, so I'm going to start off this evening by telling you a story, because I like stories, and because it's my story. It's the story of how I came to be here tonight and why I believe that Canada desperately and urgently needs electoral reform. So that's my mom and dad on the right. They arrived from Germany in the 1950s as young adults. To them, Canada was a country with a future. From the most humble of beginnings, with a bit of hard work, anyone could make a success of themselves in Canada. My parents didn't just buy into the notion of Canada as a land of opportunity, they exemplified it. By the time that I came along, the second of 2 kids, my parents owned 2 small houses, and they were well on their way to financial independence. I grew up in Glendale, a blue-collar neighborhood of Williams Lake in BC. And it was a place full of families of immigrants, just like my family. The center of the community was Glendale Elementary School, and the principal was a forceful woman named Hazel Huckvale, who you see on the right. Mrs. Huckvale was tough, but she was fair. She had a rather shrill voice that still echoes around my memory some days. But what I remember about her is the evangelical zeal that she carried. We often associate it with missionaries or ex-smokers, but her passion was Canada, and specifically the notion of Canada as a model nation, a country to be emulated. Although we were too young to wonder why it was so at the time, all of us in Glendale Elementary knew that we mattered. We knew that our family's household income level, the first language of our parents, none of that mattered. It didn't determine our path in life. We could grow up to be whatever we wanted. And we were taught that part of our country's greatness was the strength of its institutions. Things work in Canada. You could count on the court system to be fair. You could trust your police officers. And you knew that elected representatives governed for the benefit of us all. Our little neighborhood, our little mini UN, was a proud part of the rich Canadian mosaic, we were told. And we knew that we were all equal, and what's more, we all shared a responsibility to grow up and to become good Canadian citizens. Back in Glendale Elementary, we started each day off with the singing of the national anthem. And you couldn't just stand there and mumble through the words. You had to sing it loud and proud. And the funny thing was, every day, it drilled something into us. We meant it. When I hear the words, true patriot love, and we stand on guard for thee, I still have trouble not tearing up sometimes, because those words strike a very deep chord in my gut. I love this country. And the reason that I'm telling this story is because I suspect that each and every one of you is here tonight because you also love this country. Now, each of us has our own reasons for our patriotism and for what we value about Canada. But as a group, we tend to list the same sorts of things. We value our equality when accessing services like public health care and good education. We value our freedoms of speech and religion. We honestly believe that our country is enhanced by the rich blend of cultures and traditions that we embody. And we believe in inclusiveness. All people matter equally in Canada. Fairness, when it comes to justice, taxation, hiring policies, whatever, all kinds of opportunities for success. And last but not least, we also place a high value on our natural areas and our beautiful wild spaces. Our land is a huge part of how we define ourselves as Canadians. We have a lot to be proud of in Canada. But if you're like me, that pride that you used to feel wholeheartedly in our country has become a little restrained. The intrinsic belief that we live in the best country in the world is a little less certain these days. Canada's changing. Our tax system is indisputably making the rich richer while it's eroding the middle class. Our courts seem to be more concerned as of late with punishment than rehabilitation. Our environmental record, to many of us, is shameful. And our international reputation shines a little less brightly than it used to. Nanos did a poll last year that asked Canadians whether they had confidence that their government can solve problems with Aboriginal issues, health care, energy. And the finding was that Canadians were more likely not to have confidence that our government can solve these fundamental problems. And I want to think about the implications of that for a minute. In one generation, we have gone from a nation of optimists to a nation of pessimists. Why is that? Well, Fair Vote Canada's position, and mine, is that our outdated electoral system bears a large portion of the blame for our declining faith in our institutions, especially in government. We don't get what we voted for, at least not most of us. Our government doesn't accurately represent us, and our policies don't reflect the values of most Canadians. So in the next several slides, I'm going to dig deeper into what's going on with our electoral system. How is it not serving us well? What are the options out there? And if we do choose to make a change, what's involved? Welcome to Democracy 101. Canada is a representative democracy. The people vote for their representatives, who then decide policy initiatives. All modern free countries have some form of representative democracy, but there are some differences between them. And one of the chief differences is the way that we elect our representatives. So I'm going to be showing this chart a few times during the presentation, and I don't want you to get too hung up on it right now. We're going to walk through it together. Don't feel like you have to memorize it. The main point that I'd like you to be aware of for now is that there are two kinds of electoral systems, two families, if you will. One of them is the winner-take-all system, and the other one is the proportional representation style over there on the right. Now, there are many, many variations of these systems. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is kind of a summary of what's out there. Both types of systems, winner-take-all and proportional representation, have their place. Both of them work well for certain applications. So let's look first at the winner-take-all side. Winner-take-all is a very old and honorable way of conducting elections. It's simple, it's easy to understand, and as I said, it does work well for some applications. It's useful when you only want to elect one winner or when you're looking for one answer. So for example, when you're electing a party leader or a mayor, you only want one of those. If you're electing a president, as they do in the United States, this would work fine. Or if you're a municipality and you want to know whether your citizens want to go ahead with that sewage treatment plant, winner-take-all systems fit the bill. Simple one answer, yes or no. Now, the objective of this type of election is to determine the most popular choice. And by its very nature, that means you're going to have some people who are happy, the largest group, because they voted for the winner. And there will be people who cast ballots for the losing side, and they'll just have to accept that theirs wasn't the most popular choice. So we're going to look at two winner-take-all systems. And I warn you, from this point forward, there will be acronyms. Apparently, you can't talk about voting systems without getting into an alphabet soup of abbreviations, but I'll do my best to explain as we go along. Okay, we're going to start with first past the post, which you probably know is BC's and Canada's current system. Political scientists call it SMP for single member plurality, which is kind of straightforward. We're electing a single member, one, and it's a plurality that they need in order to win, which is a fancy word for saying the single largest chunk of votes. It doesn't have to be over 50%, just the single largest chunk of votes. And for this presentation, I'm going to be showing a few videos to explain the different voting systems. And we've got the first one coming up in a second here. And I want to tell you where they came from. New Zealand had an electoral change several years ago, and in preparation for that, the government prepared these educational videos. They're the clearest ones I've found in terms of explaining the systems, which is why I'm using them. So just pretend that he's another Canadian with an accent among us, and that long string of islands is just a really stretched out map of Canada. Oh, and alphabet soup alert. In New Zealand, they call first past the post FPP. We call it FPTP, same thing.
Hey there! Okay, let's take a look at first past the post, or FPP. In the FPP system, New Zealand is divided into 120 electorates, each representing a seat in Parliament. You have one vote to choose a person to represent your electorate. Whoever gets the most votes will become your local MP. They don't have to get more than half the votes to win. Under FPP, the larger parties, and especially the winning party, will usually gain a larger share of the seats in Parliament than their share of the total votes. But smaller parties and independents may win no seats at all, unless they have strong support in particular electorates. so it's hard for small parties to win seats, making it easier for one larger party to govern on its own, without the need for coalitions or agreements with other parties. And that's FPP.
Okay, so just to review that bit, first past the post, we're marking an X on our ballot, we're electing one member per district, and there's no need for more than 50% of the vote to win. Here's our chart again. So the other system on this left side is called alternative vote on this chart. Some people call it ranked ballot, preferential ballot, instant runoff. It's all the same thing. The reason that we're looking at it in greater detail is because it's one of the systems that the Liberal Party of Canada has on their list for consideration. Alternative vote in New Zealand is known as preferential vote, or PV, so AV equals PV.
Hi there. So let's look at the preferential voting system, or PV for short. In the PV system, New Zealand is divided into 120 electorates, each representing a seat in Parliament. To vote, you rank the candidates in your electorate in the order you prefer them. To win, a candidate must have the support of more than half the voters. If no one gets more than half the first preference votes, then the candidate with the fewest is dropped, and their supporter's second choice gets these votes. This continues until one candidate crosses the 50% line and becomes your electorate MP in Parliament. If your most preferred candidate doesn't win, your vote may help to elect your second or third choice. So, under PV, larger parties, and especially the winning party, usually win a larger share of the seats in Parliament than their share of the first preference votes. It's hard for small parties to win seats unless a lot of their support is in one electorate, making it more likely that one larger party will govern on its own, without the need for coalitions or agreements with other parties. And that's PV.
Click on the main points there. We're using a ranked ballot. We're going 1, 2, 3, 4. Instead of marking our ballot with a single X, we're still electing one member per district. But in this case, the winner must get a majority, which is usually accomplished through transfers. And you may have noticed that the ending section of the video was remarkably similar to the first video. It's because in this series of videos, they've used a similar format. So the same information is provided at different stages. But the reason is because alternative vote has a lot in common with first past the post. Neither system gives proportional results, which means that the votes each party receives doesn't necessarily correlate to their proportion of the seats in Parliament. In addition, studies have shown that the outcome of elections under alternative vote in 95% of the cases are identical to what would have happened with first past the post. And it's for that reason that Fair Vote Canada does not support the alternative vote, or preferential ballot if you prefer, as a desired replacement for first past the post. If you're interested in more on this system, there's a lot more on our website, so I encourage you to visit fairvote.ca, and I'll be giving you that address again later. So I want to talk a little bit now about the history of first past the post. It's been used in Canada since we achieved responsible government back in the 1800s. And as you probably know, the name comes from a horse racing analogy, where the winner was the first one past the finish line, or past the post, as it were. We've had it here for a long time, but it hasn't been stagnant over that period. Initially, you actually had to own land in order to be able to vote. And then during various periods of our history, you could forget about voting if you were part of an undesirable sect, like Catholics or Jews. Women didn't get to vote until 1918. To our shame, Aboriginal people were not allowed to vote until 1960. So there have been changes. But Fair Vote Canada believes it's high time to usher in the next development in our democratic evolution. First past the post works fine when you only want one winner. But when we elect our parliament, we're electing 308 MPs to create a representative body, one that mirrors all the different perspectives in the electorate. And first past the post doesn't do that very well at all. So let's have a look at some of the problems. The first problem is, unless you back the winner, your vote doesn't matter. It doesn't change any outcomes. How many people have cast votes for losers? Yeah, I kind of thought there might be a few of you here tonight. For your information, all those people who held up their hand when you said you cast votes for losers, you're known as orphan voters. And the reason is because our votes elected no one. And I did used to feel rather orphaned and lonely. I thought, well, that's what happens when you're part of a group with unpopular views, when you're part of a small group of people that just doesn't fit in. But then I realized, we're not necessarily a small group. In fact, we're not small at all. It's about half of the voting population in a typical Canadian election. In the 2011 federal election, which I'm showing here, voters cast 14.7 million votes. Of those, 7.3 million were wasted, basically half. Now, you might say they weren't wasted. Those people exercised their democratic privilege, and I agree with you. Good for them, good for voting. But they didn't affect any outcomes. So that means that half of those people who did bother to vote in the 2011 election could have stayed home without changing the makeup of Parliament at all. If you're interested in this, there's an excellent website, www.wastedvotes.ca. They do all sorts of statistical analysis on how many votes were effective and ineffective, all that sort of thing. Sadly, many times, way more than half the votes are wasted. And you can see how this would happen. If you have a strong group of candidates in one riding, this kind of thing might happen. They split the vote, and in this case, fully 70% of the voters in that riding elected no one. It's not unusual for the majority of votes to be wasted. Which brings us to the second major problem with first past the post. Not only are half our votes wasted, but first past the post distorts the results in each riding, and that distortion gets compounded across the country. As we saw in the video, some parties get far more seats than they earned according to their share of the popular vote, and some parties get far less. So let's have a closer look at that. This chart shows the results from the 2011 federal election, and you can see that the orange and blue sections, NDP and Conservative in this case, they magically grow as they move from the popular vote to the seats in Parliament. Whereas the smaller ones, like the Bloc Québécois and the Green Party over here, practically disappear. There is actually one very thin green slice there, you just can't see it. This is typical of the trend that we see in Canadian elections. The two parties with the most votes receive a bonus in terms of the number of seats they earn compared to their share of the popular vote. And everyone below the two most popular parties gets only a small portion of what they earned, according to the popular vote. And this chart also demonstrates one of the biggest problems with our system, what we call false or phony majorities. In this case, the Blue Party, the Conservatives, did not win more than 50% of the vote. We know they won 39.6% of the popular vote. But when that was translated into seats in the House, suddenly they had a majority. They have 54% of the seats in the House, which in our system is equivalent to 100%. We may as well paint the whole pie blue because they have complete power to do what they like in Parliament. False majorities are not a new phenomenon. In fact, for the past century, Canadians have typically been ruled by false majority governments. Here you see some of the more recent examples. As you can see, these so-called majority governments had nowhere near majority support from the electors. In fact, since World War I, Canada has had only 4 legitimate majority governments. And by legitimate majorities, I mean ones that earned over 50% of the vote. That's 4 legitimate majorities in almost 100 years. Provincially, it's not any better. Since 1952, 17 of the 18 BC elections have produced so-called majority governments. Guess how many of them earned over 50% of the vote? Anybody? 1. So even in those rare cases when a real majority is earned, the distortions can get quite bizarre. We've seen this most frequently in provincial elections, so I'll show you an example from BC in 2001. 57% of the voters supported the BC Liberals. System delivered 97% of the seats. Classic example from New Brunswick in 1987. 60% of the voters supported the New Brunswick Liberal Party, the system delivered them 100% of the seats. Some people like words, other people like pictures, so this is for you picture people. This is the same BC example. This is what the pie looked like according to the popular vote. This is what we got. So despite winning 43% of the vote, the opposition got 2 of the 79 seats in the legislature. Some of you may remember that. It was quite a situation. And probably the worst thing that the voting system does is this. It not only hands majority control to a party that didn't win a majority, but it hands it to a party that didn't even get the most votes. Here's this example, 1996 here in BC. You can see the NDP won 39% of the vote, the Liberals won 42%, the NDP won a majority government. And same thing happened in Quebec in 1998. 43% somehow beat 44% in terms of popular vote. The PQ won a majority. People say that first past the post is simple to explain and easy to understand. I think they're talking about the ballots, because the outcomes are not particularly easy to understand. Another problem with first past the post is that it forces people to make compromises, to avoid having something that they really don't want happen. So we call it strategic voting, negative voting, holding your nose. You don't want to waste your vote by casting it for a party that you support sincerely if you know they don't have a good chance of winning. So you're more likely to vote for the party that can stop the party that you really don't like. Strategic voting also encourages the formation of larger parties because small parties can split their own votes. So I'm going to use the example of an office Christmas party. Let's say your office is picking a place to go to celebrate for Christmas. Most of you want to go to a pub. Some prefer a coffee shop. Someone's helpfully made a tally chart listing all the options. And I just want you to have a look here. If your favorite pub is the Green Man, you're not likely to vote for the Green Man. You're more likely to vote for another pub that has more support. And you're going to talk to your friends, your beer drinking friends, and make sure they vote along the same lines. Because in this case, if the beer drinkers don't unite and vote strategically, the coffee drinkers are going to march right up the middle and steal your Christmas party. So moving on then to the next problem. I know there's just so many, what can I say? There really are people who voted NDP in the prairies, despite the sea of conservative blue there. And not every single person in Newfoundland voted for the Liberals. But you'd never know it from this map because the quieter voices in each area don't get represented. Only the loudest voices get sent to Parliament. So it looks like vast areas of our country have absolutely nothing in common with each other, when in reality the differences are not so striking. And when parties have to select just one candidate to run in each riding, they tend to go with the least risky option. For some reason, that's white males. Fewer minorities and women tend to be elected under first past the post. And finally, the last problem that I'm going to focus on with respect to first past the post is the effect that it has on morale. When we don't get what we voted for, and when a minority can govern as though it had a majority, we get frustrated, we get cynical, and we get apathetic. It's not good for democracy, and it's not good for Canada. So in summary, when you use the wrong voting system, that's a winner-take-all voting system, to elect a representative body like Parliament, this is what you get. You get a lot of wasted votes. You get orphan voters who feel unrepresented and often go unheard. The number of seats a party earns does not correspond to the number of people who voted for them. It creates majorities where there are none. It exaggerates legitimate majorities severely. It lets the party that won second place win first place occasionally. It forces strategic voting. It exaggerates the regional differences across our country, gives us a lack of diversity, and we end up with a lot of frustrated and unhappy voters. But here's the good news, it doesn't have to be this way. Remember this graphic. We do have choices. So I mentioned that different voting systems work well for different applications. And I pointed out that winner-take-all systems work well when we're looking for one person, like a leader of a party, a president, a mayor, whatever, or to get one answer like in a referendum question, yes or no. But when we're electing a parliament, we're voting for another reason. We're voting to create a representative group. We're voting to send people to a decision-making body to act on our behalf. When we elect a parliament, the objective is to provide political representation for all voters. And I'm going to repeat that, for all voters, not just the single largest chunk in each group. So remember what my old principal, Mrs. Huckvale, said. We're a representative democracy. Everyone's voice deserves to be heard. And for that, proportional representation fits the bill. There are many ways to design a proportional system, but the basic point common to all of them is that they translate votes into seats in a fair manner. Each party is rewarded according to the number of votes that they received. So we're going to look at two commonly discussed proportional representation systems. We're going to look at STV, single transferable vote, and MMP, or mixed member proportional. And again, these videos were made for New Zealand, and they may vary slightly from what's been proposed for Canada, but you'll get the general idea. Okay, so let's begin with single transferable vote.
In the single transferable vote system, or STV, Parliament consists of 120 seats, and New Zealand is divided up into about 27 electorates. Depending on how many people live there, each will have between 3 and 7 MPs. Each party can have more than one candidate. To vote, you choose your most preferred candidate and, if you want, your second, third, fourth choice from any party, as well as independents, as many as you like. Or instead, you can vote for your preferred party and accept its choice of candidate rankings. To win, candidates must get a minimum number of votes. This number is called the quota and varies in each electorate, depending on how many votes and how many MPs there are. If an Apple Party candidate gets more votes than they need to be elected, their voters' second choices are now in play. In this example, most of these extra votes go to another candidate from the Apple Party, so he too is elected. But there is still one seat to fill, so the lowest polling candidate is eliminated, and those votes go to his voters' second choices, who are as yet unelected. The Cherry Party's candidate is the last MP to be elected. Under STV, it's likely that the party's share of the total seats will roughly reflect their share of the total votes. So, smaller parties and independent candidates with strong local support can be elected to Parliament. Under the STV voting system, governments are often made up of more than one party in coalition, or with support agreements. And that's STV.
Just to review then, we're electing multiple representatives in each riding, and votes are transferred according to the voters' preferences until all the spots are filled. Next up is mixed member proportional, or MMP. And this is the system that the Law Commission of Canada recommended that we adopt after a very comprehensive consultation process. And it's also the one that the federal New Democrats have promised to implement in the next term if they are elected.
So, let's have a look at the mixed member proportional system, or MMP. In the MMP system, you have two votes. The first vote is for the party you prefer. This is the vote that largely decides the total number of seats each party will have of the 120 seats in Parliament. If 40% of us vote for the Cherry Party, it will get around 40% of all the seats in Parliament. If 10% of us vote for the Pear Party, it will get about 10% of the seats. Your second vote is to choose a person to represent your local electorate in Parliament. Under MMP, New Zealand is divided into 70 electorates. Whoever gets the most votes will become your local MP. They don't have to get more than half the votes to win. To get any seats in Parliament, a party must reach at least 5% of the party vote, or win an electorate seat. So let's see what can happen. The Cherry Party has won 25% of the party vote, which is equal to 30 seats in Parliament. These are filled, firstly, by the electorate seats they won, and the rest by MPs from its party list. The Pear Party hasn't won any electorate seats, but because it won 10% of the party vote, it's entitled to 10% of all the seats in Parliament. all come from its party list. The Banana Party only won 4% of the party vote, which is under the 5% threshold. But because they won one electorate, they are entitled to 4% of all the seats in Parliament. As its name says, MMP is a proportional system. This means there is likely to be a range of big and small parties in Parliament. Under the MMP voting system, governments are usually made up of more than one party, in coalition or with support agreements. And that's MMP.
To repeat the key points there, you have a two-part ballot. On one side, you have a vote for the party of your choice, and on the other side, you're voting for a local representative. So there we go, two common proportional systems. They might be a little more complicated to explain than first past the post, but they do work perfectly well in other countries, and I have no doubt that Canadians can wrap our heads around this as well. Sadly, not everyone is as convinced of this as I am. When some people talk about proportional representation, they act as though Canada would be adopting some wild and crazy political experiment, unexplored territory politically. They think winner-take-all systems are used everywhere, aren't they? No. Most developed countries saw the problems with first-past-the-post last century and adopted proportional systems a long time ago. Not one of the new democracies that emerged with the fall of the Soviet Union chose a winner-take-all system. In fact, only 5 of 34 members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development states use winner-take-all systems. Basically, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is the list of the most developed countries in the world. So those 5 of 34 that use winner-take-all systems, you can see on the map here, Canada and the United States. There's England, there's France, there's all these countries that used to be colonies of England and France. And there's Australia, which also was a colony, but I'm pointing it out because it's kind of misleading there. They do actually use proportional representation for half of their elections, for their upper house. Their lower house still uses first past the post. So really there are only 4 major countries that still, 4 OECD countries that use it for all their elections. The rest of the world has evolved. So just to give you an idea, this is the list of countries that use proportional representation. I don't expect you to read it all. I'm not going to leave it up there for a long time. But as you can see, the list is pretty long. And it includes most of the global heavy hitters. And here's the list of countries still using winner-take-all systems. Once you get past the first 4, I don't know. Do we have a lot in common? I'd argue that we have more in common with the other list. So now let's start talking about all the reasons why all those other countries have chosen to shift to proportional representation. And I think you'll find that they align pretty closely with those Canadian values that we talked about earlier. So in the next several slides, I'm going to be showing the results of several studies and quoting several statistics and indices. I'm not going to list the names of all the studies. I do have them. If you would like the sources, please ask me for a list later. I have them with me. So proportional representation tends to produce legislatures which better reflect the various perspectives of voters. Composition of Parliament more closely resembles the composition of the electorate, and the legislation produced more closely aligns with the views of the median voter. Since a single party rarely earns more than 50% of the vote, 2 or more parties usually govern together in a coalition, and between them, they represent a genuine majority of voters. So not only do you get parties with their fair share of seats in the House, but you also get legislation that reflects the general view of the majority of voters. Pretty cool concept. We already saw that one of the big problems with first past the post is that it wastes a lot of votes, forcing people to vote strategically, because our vote it's not equal, because if we choose the candidate that we sincerely support without a hope of winning, we know we're not affecting any outcomes. So under proportional representation, you don't have to vote strategically, because there's more than one winner. So a far greater proportion of the votes actually elect someone. You can actually vote for a party that you support, knowing that they don't have to win the whole thing in order for your votes to count. Your chances of being an orphaned voter, that is a voter who elected no one, are much, much smaller. But the proof is in the pudding. So in recent elections in Sweden, Norway, and New Zealand, which are the countries at the top, About 97% of the votes cast elected someone. Compare that with Canada. The 3 most recent elections, which are the ones at the bottom there, were about 50%. That is a stark contrast. Our voting rates in Canada are not terrific, and they're dropping. In fact, we've dropped about 10% since 1980. Canada ranks 26th out of those 34 OECD countries that I talked about earlier in voter turnout. Countries with proportional representation experience higher voter turnout. For example, over the past 7 elections, Canada's average turnout was 63.4%. Compare that with New Zealand, 81.2%. In this graphic, the green line represents the OECD average for voter turnout, and it's at 70%. The countries above that line happen to use proportional representation. The countries below happen to use first past the post. Is this a coincidence? I think not. People under proportional representation are generally happier with the state of their democracy. No wonder. They feel empowered. Their votes actually elected someone, and the policies reflect their genuine wishes. We also tend to get better governance under proportional representation. Winner-take-all governments tend to concentrate power in the hands of a bare majority or even a plurality, leading to, and I'm quoting from the study here, exclusive, competitive, and adversarial behavior. Consensus governments force broader participation and broader agreement, leading to inclusiveness, bargaining, and compromise. Doesn't that sound Canadian? And since a few percentage change in popular support means very little change in the composition of the parliament, this kind of broader agreement results in a more steady path forward in terms of policy direction over time. You don't have alternating majority governments swinging back and forth and undoing each other's policies, as we've certainly seen in British Columbia in the past. Proportional representation countries get higher scores on the United Nations Index of Human Development, which incorporates health, education, and standard of living indicators. We already know that Canadians believe that everyone should be able to realize their potential and to share the benefits of growth and prosperity. Countries with proportional representation have lower income inequality, a strong and significant effect. I'm going to call countries with proportional representation consensual democracies because they govern with the consent of more than one party. Consensual political institutions tend to reduce income inequalities, whereas majoritarian and plurality institutions have the opposite effect. Countries with consensual democracies scored significantly higher on the Yale University Environmental Performance Index. As well, they're responsible for a shrinking share of world carbon emissions, and they were able to more quickly ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And in case you're curious about that Yale Environmental Index, it measures 10 policy areas, including environmental health, air quality, resource management, biodiversity and habitat, forestry, fisheries, agriculture, and climate change. So the whole gamut. Minorities of all types are better represented under proportional representation. On average, they elect 8% more women. And parties of all political persuasions tend to make sure their party lists pay attention to gender equity and demographic diversity, because they know that list is going to come under scrutiny. This next one comes as a surprise to a lot of people. Countries with proportional representation are less likely to have deficits and more likely to have fiscal surpluses. That was a study done by the London School of Economics, not exactly a left-wing pinko institute. Both proportional and semi-proportional systems, someone's not agreeing with me over here, I think. Both proportional and semi-proportional systems produced higher economic growth, a strong and significant effect again. Finally, stability. There's a myth out there that governments under proportional representation are always at risk of falling and that you're going to have more frequent elections. Simply not true. Between 1945 and 1998, Countries using first-past-the-post average 16.7 elections, where countries under proportional representation averaged 16. Not a big difference either way, but I want to point out that that 16 includes Italy and Israel, two countries that have a system that was never, ever, ever recommended for Canada. I think it's time to acknowledge that our country is suffering from electoral dysfunction. But there is a cure, and we can choose to make a change. Our country has come of age. We deserve to have a well-functioning voting system. Why should we struggle under an outdated and unjust system simply because it's the way things have always been done? Most Canadians favor significant action on climate change. Poll after poll shows that. Most Canadians want to maintain strong public services. We want to protect our beautiful rivers and our wild areas. Most Canadians want tax fairness. We still hold precious that dream that people of humble beginnings can make it in this land of opportunity. 13 years of public opinion polls show that a strong majority of Canadians, including voters from all parties, support proportional representation. The last poll was done in April 2013. The number was 70%. We can have polite academic arguments forever about the various pros and cons of different electoral systems. The fact is, there is one clear winner. Every single group that has seriously compared electoral systems in Canada and around the world has come to the same conclusion. Proportional representation simply works better. In Canada, we have 10 assemblies and commissions who have now recommended that we adopt some form of proportional representation, including the BC Citizens Assembly in 2004, the Ontario Citizens Assembly in 2007, the Quebec equivalent in 2003, and as I mentioned earlier, the Law Commission of Canada in 2004. And here's the thing. It wouldn't be very hard to change it. We can change our voting system through a bill in Parliament. We don't need to change the Constitution. There's not even a legal requirement for a citizens' assembly or a referendum. And some people will argue that we've had enough of those already. It's time to make a decision. I believe we're at a crossroads. We can let things continue as they have been, or we can demand that our government actually represent us and become more accountable. First past the post has weaknesses that are being abused to an extent that was never imagined by those well-meaning nobles who developed the system back in the 12th century. 12th century, I'm not kidding. First past the post does our population as well as our politicians a disservice. Politicians used to be respected as self-sacrificing, community-minded public servants, and I believe that's what they all set out to be. But often now, they are viewed as little more than untrustworthy loudmouths because of the adversarial nature of our electoral system. Debate and decorum have deteriorated. Basic respect for colleagues across the aisle has evaporated. First past the post is killing democracy in Canada. It's contributing to voter cynicism and the distrust of public institutions, which is corroding our national fabric. What do you choose? And guess what? If change is going to happen, the people who are in this room tonight are the ones that are going to lead the charge. If you want it, you're going to have to demand the change. So congratulations, you are the chosen ones. You are the ones we're depending on to lead this charge. I urge you to help make electoral reform happen, and the best way to do that is to be loud. Talk to people about the need for electoral reform. Talk to people about it at work. Talk to your kids, your parents, your friends. Write some letters to the editor, or write some extra ones and bring them to a table at the farmer's market for other people to sign. Make a yard sign that says you're voting on the basis of proportional representation. Most importantly, talk to your MP. Ask for a commitment to proportional representation. We need to make this an election issue. We need to let our elected representatives know that we expect change in the next term. Fair Vote Canada is collecting signatures. I hope some of you signed it on the way in. If not, they're still there on the way out for the Declaration of Voters' Rights. And there's an online link to that at our website. Forward it to your friends if you think it's important. Become a member of Fair Vote Canada if you like. Give a donation if you can. So as I'm wrapping up, I want to double back to where I started. I told you the story of my childhood in Glendale and how I was taught to be proud of my country and the responsibility that I had to care for it. In 10 years, I still want to be proud of Canada. And I don't want to have that niggling doubt and that pessimism that's been creeping in. That's why I'm choosing to speak on behalf of Fair Vote Canada. I hope I've inspired you to take up the cause. If there ever was a time to stand up for our country, this is it.